Here is a question that sounds paradoxical and is not. Should a society that values tolerance tolerate intolerance?
The naive answer is yes. A tolerant society tolerates everything. The moment you refuse to tolerate something, you have become intolerant, which is a contradiction.
The more careful answer is no. And the reasoning is not complicated once you see it. If you tolerate intolerant movements that are explicitly committed to destroying the conditions of tolerance itself, you are not practicing tolerance. You are providing the conditions for tolerance's own destruction. Unlimited tolerance is self-defeating.
Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Claire.
And I'm Sean. Karl Popper made this argument in a footnote in 1945. It is probably the most widely shared philosophical text on the internet and one of the most consistently misread. Today, we are going to read it carefully, understand what Popper actually argued, where it applies and where it does not, and what it means for the genuinely hard political questions about speech, association, and the limits of freedom in a democratic society. Big ideas, human conversations, let's go.
One thing worth saying before we begin. This is an episode where we are going to try very hard to let the argument be what it is, rather than what we would like it to be. The paradox of tolerance is one of those ideas that people tend to approach with conclusions already in hand. Either they want it to license suppression of political opponents, or they want to dismiss it entirely as a rationalization for censorship. Both of those readings are failures. The philosophical work is in resisting both of them and staying with the actual argument. Karl Popper was born in Vienna in 1902 into a Jewish family that had converted to Christianity. He studied philosophy, mathematics, and psychology at the University of Vienna, and he moved in the intellectual circles that produced the Vienna Circle, the group of logical positivists whose work in the philosophy of science would shape much of 20th century analytic philosophy. Popper was never a member of the Vienna Circle, and his relationship to logical positivism was largely critical. But the intellectual environment of interwar Vienna shaped his questions in permanent ways.
His most important contribution to the philosophy of science is the concept of falsifiability, which we touched on in the cognitive bias episode. His argument is that the distinguishing mark of a genuine scientific claim is not that it can be verified. Many non-scientific claims can be supported by evidence, but that it can in principle be falsified. A scientific theory makes predictions that could be shown to be wrong. If no possible observation could count against a theory, it is not doing the work of science. This was aimed partly at Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxist historical theory, both of which he thought were structured to absorb any counter-evidence rather than expose themselves to it.
He left Austria in 1937, before the Anschluss, and spent the war years in New Zealand, where he wrote his two major political works, The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1945, and The Poverty of Historicism, also 1945. These were explicitly political books, written in response to the rise of totalitarianism in Europe, and motivated by the question that occupied many of the most serious thinkers of the era. How did this happen, and what does it mean for how free societies should organize themselves?
The Open Society and Its Enemies is a long and dense work, organized around a critique of what Popper calls historicism, the belief that history follows determinate laws, and that the task of politics is to bring about the historically inevitable outcome. He locates this tendency in Plato, in Hegel, and in Marx, and he argues that it is the intellectual foundation of totalitarianism that the willingness to sacrifice present individuals for the sake of a historical destiny is what licenses the atrocities committed in the name of both fascism and communism.
The paradox of tolerance appears in a footnote to that book, a brief but carefully argued note that has taken on a life of its own, entirely separate from the broader argument. It is worth reading it in context, because what Popper is arguing is considerably more specific and more modest than the popular versions suggest.
The Open Society and Its Enemies is worth understanding a little more fully because the paradox of tolerance is embedded in a larger philosophical project that shapes its meaning. The book's central argument is that the great totalitarian movements of the 20th century, both fascism and Soviet communism, were not accidents or failures of political will. They were the expression of a particular kind of philosophical error. The belief that history follows determinate laws and that politics consists of managing the transition to a historically inevitable outcome. Plato's philosopher kings, Hegel's world spirit, Marx's laws of historical materialism, Popper saw these as structurally similar and as structurally dangerous because they all license the sacrifice of real present individuals for the sake of an abstract historical destination.
Against this historicism, Popper argues for what he calls piecemeal social engineering, modest, reversible, empirically testable interventions in social problems, as opposed to the grand utopian transformations that historicist thinking tends to produce. His political philosophy is essentially Popperian in its epistemology. Just as good science proceeds by making falsifiable predictions and revising them when they fail, good politics proceeds by making modest interventions and revising them when they produce bad outcomes. The open society is one organized around this kind of fallibilist, revisable, self-correcting approach to collective life.
Understanding this context matters for the paradox of tolerance because it clarifies what Popper is trying to protect. He is not defending tolerance as an abstract value in isolation. He is defending the conditions of the open society, the framework of rational discourse, political pluralism, and revisable institutions that makes genuine tolerance possible. The paradox arises because those conditions can be undermined by movements that use the protections of the open society to destroy it. And Popper's response to that paradox is shaped by his broader commitment to a political philosophy that is humble about its own fallibility, but firm in its defense of the conditions of fallibilism itself. Let me quote Popper's actual words, because precision matters here. He wrote, "Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them."
So far, this is the version most people know. What almost never gets quoted is what comes next. He writes, "I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the expression of intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check in this way, suppression would certainly be unwise. We should claim the right to suppress them only if they are not prepared to engage in rational discussion."
That qualification changes the argument substantially. Popper is not saying that intolerant ideas should be suppressed. He is making a much more specific claim that a tolerant society has the right to suppress intolerance when that intolerance refuses rational engagement and instead resorts to violence or the threat of violence to advance its ends. The threshold is not offensive ideas. It is the abandonment of rational discourse in favor of force.
He continues, "We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right to not tolerate the intolerant. We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal, in the same way as we would consider incitement to murder."
The incitement to murder analogy is important. Popper is placing the paradox of tolerance in legal and political rather than purely philosophical territory. He is not arguing for a thought police that suppresses offensive opinions. He is arguing that movements whose explicit aim is the violent destruction of the open society, movements that have abandoned rational engagement as a matter of principle, have forfeited the protections that the open society extends to participants in rational discourse.
The context of 1945 is essential. Popper is writing in the immediate aftermath of a world war, at the moment when the full scale of the Holocaust is becoming known, with direct personal experience of what happened when European liberal democracies failed to recognize or failed to act on the threat posed by movements explicitly committed to their destruction. He is not writing an abstract philosophical treatise. He is writing a diagnosis and a prescription shaped by a catastrophe that had just occurred.
Understanding that context does not mean accepting the argument uncritically, but it does mean being fair about what the argument is for and what conditions produced it. Popper was not trying to provide a tool for suppressing political opponents. He was trying to identify the specific conditions under which a commitment to tolerance requires the refusal of tolerance, and he was quite precise about those conditions.
It is also worth noting what Popper does not say, because the omissions are as important as the text. He does not say that offensive ideas should be suppressed. He does not say that ideas we find wrong or harmful are thereby intolerant in his sense. He does not say that the majority has the right to silence minorities it finds threatening. He does not provide a general license for restricting speech in the name of protecting tolerance. All of those readings are distortions, some of them motivated distortions by people who want the authority of a serious philosopher behind positions that Popper explicitly did not hold.
His own political record is instructive here. Popper was a defender of individual rights, a critic of nationalism, and an opponent of any political philosophy that privileged collective identity over individual liberty. He was also, throughout his career, deeply worried about the use of epistemically immodest philosophical systems that claimed certain knowledge of historical destiny or social truth to justify the suppression of dissent. A reading of his paradox that converts it into a tool for confident suppression of disagreeable views would have horrified him. The paradox is a narrow exception to a very broad principle of tolerance, not an invitation to reverse the principle.
Let us get more precise about the philosophical structure of the argument, because I think it is genuinely interesting and genuinely difficult, and the popular treatment rarely does it justice.
The core insight is about the conditions of possibility for tolerance itself. Tolerance is not a value that can exist in a vacuum. It requires a social and political environment that sustains its institutions, norms, practices, a shared commitment to rational discourse as the primary means of resolving disagreement. When those conditions are present, tolerance is possible. When they are destroyed, tolerance is destroyed with them.
So the question becomes, does extending tolerance to movements that are explicitly committed to destroying those conditions serve the value of tolerance, or does it undermine it? Popper's answer is that unlimited tolerance undermines itself, that the tolerant society that refuses to defend its conditions of possibility against movements committed to those conditions' destruction is not practicing a purer or more consistent form of tolerance. It is making tolerance impossible.
This is a form of what philosophers call a reflexivity argument, an argument about what it takes for a principle to be coherent and sustainable rather than self-defeating. The principle of unlimited tolerance is reflexively incoherent. If applied consistently, it undermines the conditions that make tolerance possible. A limited tolerance, one that excludes movements committed to destroying the framework of rational discourse and political pluralism, is more coherent because it is more consistent with its own conditions of possibility.
There is a useful analogy with free speech. Most serious defenses of free speech do not extend to all speech in all circumstances. They exclude direct incitement to imminent violence. They exclude speech that constitutes a direct threat to a specific person. They exclude certain kinds of fraud. These exclusions are not betrayals of the principle of free speech. They are acknowledgments that free speech, like tolerance, is a value that depends on conditions that can be undermined, and that protecting those conditions sometimes requires limiting the application of the principle to cases that would destroy it.
John Rawls, in his theory of justice, made a related point about constitutional democracy. He argued that a liberal democratic order is not required to be neutral between all conceptions of the good. It can and should be partial toward conceptions of the good that are compatible with liberal democracy's own conditions, political pluralism, basic rights, the rule of law, and it can legitimately refuse to extend full protection to conceptions of the good that are explicitly committed to destroying those conditions. That is not a betrayal of liberalism. It is a recognition that liberalism, like any political system, has conditions of possibility that must be protected. John Stuart Mill's harm principle is another useful reference point here. Mill argued in On Liberty that the only legitimate basis for restricting individual freedom is to prevent harm to others. The paradox of tolerance can be read as a specific application of the harm principle to political movements. A movement that is explicitly committed to destroying the conditions of freedom for everyone else is causing a distinctive kind of harm, not to any individual in a direct sense, but to the framework that protects everyone's freedom. Tolerating it is, in Mill's terms, permitting a harm.
The difficulty, of course, is that the harm principle is itself contested in its application. What counts as harm? How direct does the connection between speech and harm need to be? Who adjudicates? Mill's framework does not automatically answer these questions any more than Popper's does. What both frameworks do is establish that the question is not simply, is this idea offensive or wrong? The question is, does tolerating this contribute to harm that undermines the conditions under which tolerance itself is possible? That is a more demanding and more specific question, and it is the right one to be asking. The paradox of tolerance is probably the most frequently misapplied philosophical argument in current public discourse, and I think it is worth being careful and honest about how and why.
The most common misuse is to treat it as a general license for suppressing speech or ideas that one finds offensive, harmful, or disagreeable. The argument is invoked against positions that are certainly unpopular and possibly wrong, but that are participating in rational discourse rather than explicitly committed to destroying it. That is not what Popper argued. His threshold was high and specific. movements that have abandoned rational engagement and resort to the threat or use of violence to advance their aims.
The second misuse is to conflate intolerance with disagreement. Disagreement, even sharp and painful disagreement, is not intolerance in Popper's sense. A political movement that argues for positions you find deeply wrong on immigration, on economic policy, on social norms, is not thereby committed to the destruction of the framework of rational discourse and political pluralism. It is participating in that framework, however imperfectly and however much you object to its conclusions. Popper's paradox does not apply to it.
The third misuse is the weaponization of the argument. Any powerful philosophical tool can be used by bad actors. And the paradox of tolerance is particularly vulnerable because it can be framed in ways that justify suppressing the speech of minorities, dissidents, or any group the suppressor wants to portray as committed to intolerance. The history of the last century is full of examples of liberal norms being invoked to suppress the speech and political activity of exactly the people those norms were supposed to protect. Popper's argument does not sanction that, but it can be deformed to appear to.
The test that Popper himself specifies is whether the movement in question has abandoned rational engagement in favor of force. That is a demanding test. It excludes most political speech, most social movements, most of the political activity that takes place within liberal democracies. The movements it does include, and Popper had in mind the explicitly fascist and Nazi movements that had just devastated Europe, are characterized by their explicit rejection of political pluralism as a framework, their use of violence, or the threat of violence, as a political tool, and their stated intention to permanently eliminate the conditions for rational political competition.
One of the philosophical virtues of Popper's formulation is precisely its narrowness. He is not trying to give you a general theory of what speech should be permitted. He is identifying a specific threshold condition under which a tolerant society is permitted, he would say, required, to act in its own defense. The narrowness is a feature, not a flaw. A broad principle that licenses the suppression of anything anyone calls intolerant is more dangerous than useful. A narrow principle that identifies a specific and well-defined threat is philosophically responsible.
There is also a rhetorical problem worth naming directly. The paradox of tolerance has become a meme, a piece of text stripped from its context, shared without the qualifications, used as a conversation stopper rather than a starting point for careful thinking. When a philosophical argument becomes a meme, it tends to lose exactly the precision that gave it its value. The Popper quote that circulates online is usually the dramatic first sentence. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance without the immediately following qualification that suppression should be a last resort only when rational argument has definitively failed. The truncated version is a much more dangerous instrument than the complete one.
This is a general problem with philosophical ideas in public discourse, and it is one of the reasons this show exists. The trolley problem, the banality of evil, the paradox of tolerance, all of these are ideas that have been popularized in ways that preserve the provocative surface and discard the careful substance. The philosophical work lies precisely in the qualifications, the distinctions, the acknowledgments of difficulty that the popular versions tend to strip away. Knowing that unlimited tolerance is self-defeating is the beginning of a serious conversation, not its conclusion. The hard work is in figuring out what follows from that, and Popper knew that the hard work was the point.
Popper's argument is compelling within its own terms. But I want to raise some harder questions, because I think the easy version, the one that circulates on social media, leaves the genuinely difficult work undone.
The first hard question is about the threshold. Popper says, the paradox applies when a movement has abandoned rational engagement in favor of violence. But the line between robust political advocacy and the threat of violence is not always clear. Movements that use heated rhetoric, that deploy intimidation, that create climates of fear without explicitly inciting violence, where do they fall? The philosopher Jeremy Waldron has argued that hate speech, even when it stops short of explicit incitement, can so thoroughly undermine the conditions of equal standing in a political community that it functions as a kind of structural violence against the people targeted. Does that qualify? Popper's framework does not obviously answer that question.
The second hard question is about who decides. In practice, the determination of whether a movement has crossed Popper's threshold has to be made by someone by courts, by legislatures, by political majorities. And those institutions are not neutral. They have interests. They have biases. The history of laws against sedition, against disloyal speech, against political extremism is largely a history of those laws being applied disproportionately against minorities, labor organizers, anti-war activists, and critics of power, precisely the people whose speech most needs protection. The risk that Popper's principle will be weaponized is not a theoretical possibility. It is what has repeatedly happened.
This does not invalidate the paradox. It means that any serious application of it has to include robust procedural protections against its own abuse independent courts, strong due process, meaningful standards of proof, and genuine openness to the possibility that the person claiming to apply the principle is themselves the threat to the open society rather than its defender. Those are not philosophical additions to Popper's argument. They are necessary conditions for it to do what he intended rather than what he feared.
The third hard question is about the long game. Popper argues that rational argument should be tried first, that suppression should be a last resort when rational engagement has definitively failed. But there is a significant body of empirical research suggesting that some forms of deplatforming, removing extremist content and accounts from major platforms, reduces the spread of extremist ideas more effectively than engaging with those ideas. If counterargument is not reliably effective against certain kinds of radicalizing content, does that change the calculus? Popper was writing before the internet, before algorithmic amplification, before the specific conditions of contemporary information environments. His principle needs to be applied to conditions he could not have foreseen.
And the fourth hard question, the one I find most philosophically interesting, is about the relationship between the paradox of tolerance and democratic legitimacy. Popper's argument is that tolerance has conditions of possibility that must be protected. But in a democracy, the people are supposed to be the source of legitimacy for political decisions. What happens when a democratic majority chooses, through legitimate processes, to move in a direction that undermines the conditions of future democracy? Is that the paradox of tolerance applying to democratic self-governance? And if so, who has the standing to invoke it? These are not settled questions. They are the live political philosophy questions of the present moment. The political philosopher Stephen Levitsky, in his work on democratic backsliding, has documented how democracies in the contemporary world tend not to end with military coups with a dramatic rupture that everyone can see and respond to. They end gradually, through the incremental erosion of institutions by elected leaders who use democratic processes to accumulate power and progressively dismantle the checks on that power. The paradox of tolerance, applied to this phenomenon, generates a genuinely difficult question. At what point does democratic self-defense against an elected government that is systematically dismantling democratic institutions become legitimate? And at what point does that self-defense itself become the threat to democratic norms?
Popper's framework does not answer that question, but it gives us the right vocabulary for asking it. The question is not, does this government have policies I oppose? The question is this government systematically dismantling the conditions, the independent institutions, the free press, the rule of law, the protection of minority rights that make future democratic correction possible? That is a more demanding and more specific question. And it is one that citizens in any democracy need to be able to ask and answer with something more than partisan preference as a guide.
I want to say something about why this episode felt important to include beyond the obvious contemporary relevance. Because I think the paradox of tolerance, properly understood, illustrates something about philosophy that matters for the whole project of this show.
Philosophy is not primarily a tool for winning arguments. It is a tool for thinking more carefully, for identifying what you actually believe, why you believe it, and what follows from it. The paradox of tolerance is a case where the careful thinking leads somewhere uncomfortable. If you are genuinely committed to tolerance as a value, you have to follow the argument through to its conclusion, which includes the conclusion that unlimited tolerance is self-defeating. That is not a comfortable conclusion for many people who identify strongly with tolerance as a value, but following it is what intellectual honesty requires.
At the same time, the careful thinking also reveals the limits and the potential abuses of the argument. Knowing that unlimited tolerance is self-defeating does not tell you where exactly the threshold is, who gets to draw it, or how to prevent the principle from being weaponized. Those are genuinely hard questions, and philosophy does not resolve them by fiat. What it does is make you more careful about how you deploy the principle, less likely to use it loosely as a rhetorical weapon, more likely to apply it with the specificity and rigor that Popper himself brought to it. There is something in Popper's broader epistemological framework, his fallibilism, his insistence that all knowledge is provisional and subject to revision, that should shape how we hold his political conclusions as well. He would not want us to treat the paradox of tolerance as a settled answer to an open question. He would want us to hold it as our best current understanding, subject to revision, as evidence and argument accumulate. The open society is open not just politically, but epistemically. It is organized around the recognition that we can be wrong, that our institutions can fail, that our principles can have unintended consequences that need to be addressed. That epistemic humility should govern how we apply the paradox, as much as how we apply any other principle.
What Popper gives us, finally, is not a formula but a way of asking the question: is this movement participating in the framework of rational discourse and political competition, or is it explicitly committed to destroying that framework? That question will not always have an easy answer, but it is the right question, more precise than "do I agree with this?" and more demanding than "is this offensive?" It requires you to think about the conditions of the system itself, not just about your position within it. And that kind of thinking about the conditions rather than just the contents of political life is exactly what philosophical education is supposed to produce. Popper spent most of his career arguing for what he called the open society, a society organized around rational criticism, political pluralism, and the protection of individual rights against both tyranny and the false certainties of historical inevitability. The paradox of tolerance is not a departure from that commitment, it is a defense of it. And the willingness to think carefully about the conditions under which that commitment can be consistently held, rather than either abandoning it in the name of unlimited permissiveness or weaponizing it in the name of political convenience, is exactly the kind of philosophical work that the open society needs its citizens to do.
The connection back to Arendt is worth making explicit, because I think these two episodes belong together. Arendt asked, how do ordinary people participate in the destruction of a free society without recognizing what they are doing? Her answer was the failure to think, the bureaucratic thoughtlessness that allows atrocity to proceed through the accumulation of individually defensible steps. Popper is asking a related question. What structural conditions allow a free society to protect itself against those who would destroy it from within? His answer is the paradox of tolerance, the recognition that the open society must be willing to defend its own conditions of possibility.
Together, they are describing the two failure modes of liberal democracy. One is internal, the gradual erosion of genuine thinking and genuine political engagement that leaves institutions hollow and populations susceptible to authoritarian capture. The other is external, the extension of democratic protections to movements explicitly committed to the democracy's destruction. Both failures are real, both have historical precedents. And both require not just institutional responses, but the kind of sustained philosophical attention that this show is trying to model, the willingness to think carefully about hard questions rather than reaching for easy answers in either direction.
Next week, we are moving into mathematics again, the philosophy of probability. We are catastrophically bad at understanding probability, and it shapes every important decision we make. From Pascal's wager to Bayesian reasoning, how mathematical thinking can correct our most dangerous intuitions about risk and evidence.
If this episode gave you a more precise way to think about a debate you have been having, share it with the person you have been having it with. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for.
Sources and further reading are in the show notes.
We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Sunday.
Big ideas, human conversations.
See you next week.